Now to the other big story in our special interview tonight. The Fed's zeroing in on a man who could know more about Donald Trump's finances than just about anyone. In a moment, I'm going to speak with someone with many unique insights into what's at stake, Donald Trump's former longtime litigator. Here is the story. As mentioned, the Wall Street Journal shows that prosecutors are subpoenaing this man as part of a grand jury probe into Michael Cohen. Allen Weisselberg is a key player in the Trump organization. He's described as the financial gatekeeper. Ivanka Trump once saying he's deeply passionate, fiercely loyal, and has stood alongside my father and our family for over 3 decades. I'm going to get to Nick Ackerman in a minute for analysis, but we begin as promised with Jay Goldberg, who was Donald Trump's exclusive litigator from 1992 until 2012 and became his advisor, including up to the president. Jay, what does it mean that Weisselberg is headed to the grand jury?
Do you mind if I just say that with respect to Paul Butler, Martha Stewart lied under oath and was prosecuted for making a false statement, not obstruction of justice. And that for obstruction of justice, you need that the conduct was intended to make it more difficult to complete the grand jury proceeding, and that's not true.
Let me get back in on you, and then we'll still have to do our interview topic, but I don't mind you saying that at all. I think Mr. Butler's referring to the nature of obstruction, as you and I know, and I think the viewers have been learning as we all dig into this. There are a whole battery of different statutes that involve the kind of conduct that can impede an investigation, false statements to authorities in the case of Ms. Stewart and the SDNY, but other types of obstruction in the presidential context. It wouldn't be a statute for Donald Trump anyway, right? It would only be whether the Congress decides that's an abuse of power.
And whether he made it more difficult for Mr. Mueller to complete his task. And his statements of opinion don't measure up. The Supreme Court has taken pains to narrow obstruction of justice. And I want to get this in quickly. I expected obstruction of justice to be raised because Weissman, who's the chief deputy, tried the Arthur Anderson Enron case, secured a conviction. 1,000 people lost the job. The Arthur Anderson was destroyed, and then it was reversed.
Sure. Now, Jay, you know I respect
obstruction of justice.
Jay, you know I respect you, and you have a lot more years of litigation experience than I do. But can we talk about the news of the day for our interview?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
We can. There's no better person that I met in my years than Allen Weisselberg. He's a person who knows everything, and it would be a shame to bring Trump down with respect to this silly payment of monies to women. The conduct of Trump pales to insignificance when measured against prior presidents. But in terms of Allen Weisselberg, he knows everything. And he's a gentle, fine person who will tell the truth.
You agree that he knows everything. Does that mean that if there were any financial problems in the history of the Trump organization, which may not be fair for the SDNY to pursue on a current president, I think that's a debatable question, but if there were problems, if there was money laundering, if there was misstatements to authorities, do you think he would cough that up accurately to the grand jury?
I doubt that occurred, but he would know everything. No one is closer to Donald than Allen Weisselberg. He's more on top of things than anybody in the entire organization because he's a decent guy who does the right thing. And I found him to be so in the 20 years that I was there. And it would surprise me that he was involved in covering up for money laundering. You can't do better.
And Jay, what do you think his relationship is with Michael Cohen at this point? Do you think that he has a positive relationship with Cohen, or that they are now in some kind of dispute or at odds?
No, they're in a negative position, and so is the government, hostile to Cohen. The government doesn't like the release of these tapes. It's so early in an investigation. This is Lanny Davis's action. A prosecutor likes to keep all the tapes quietly. In addition,
do you think, Jay, let me ask you this. Do you think, Jay...
It alerts Trump to the danger of
Sure.
talking because things might be taped. And a prosecutor often uses
Sure.
taped conversations. Now Trump is on notice.
Now, Jay, one more. I got to get one more question in, and then I'm going to go to another guest. My final question to you: do you think Lanny Davis is doing a good job as a lawyer here, or do you see anything inappropriate in what he's done this week for Cohen?
Inappropriate. This is not something that furthers the interests of Cohen. Cohen should be doing whatever he's doing to the U.S. attorney, and the U.S. attorney should decide when things are to be released. Lanny Davis is not serving the interests of his client, but he could be counted on to do what he thinks is best for the Clintons. And if it means maligning the Clintons through Cohen, that's what he'll be doing.
You think, well, hold on, that's very interesting, and we always appreciate you giving us your unvarnished view. You're making an assertion that, of course, would be negative about Lanny as a lawyer. Your view is that Lanny Davis is basically selling out Michael Cohen to do the political work of the Clintons?
I have an opinion that Lanny Davis is motivated by a belief that there was meddling and it had the effect of taking the election victory from Mrs. Clinton. There are a couple of people, him, Paul Begaglia, Terry McAuliffe, that will do anything to further the interests of the Clintons at the expense of anyone. And Lanny Davis is doing something that, if Nick Ackerman is on the line, witnesses don't do. This premature disclosure of taped evidence alerts the target, be it Trump or any other person.
Well, here's what I'll do.
That taping
we've
is
run
the
long.
order of the day.
I don't control time. We've run long. Jay Goldberg, as always, thank you for being here. You mentioned Nick Ackerman, who is here. I'm going to get you a response. I want to give some context, though, as we think about the money man. That's pretty interesting. If you've ever seen any court drama, you know that the bookkeeper is a key figure in any potential conspiracy. Who can forget this classic scene from The Untouchables?
You were in charge of disbursements for Mr. Capone?
Yes, I was.
Would you tell us the amounts?
In a 3-year period, I personally disbursed monies to Mr. Capone in excess of $1.33 million.
It all came down in that one to the accountant. Now, that's just a movie. Jay Goldberg name-checked you. I give you the floor.
Well, first of all, Mr. Weisselberg, I mean, if you take Jay at his word, Mr. Weisselberg could be a powerful witness for the government. He actually prepared Donald Trump's tax returns. I mean, when you have a tax case or you have a tax return, there are a lot of items on that return that are ambiguous, that don't really tell you a lot unless you get behind the companies or the individual entries on there. And what Weisselberg can do is really illuminate where all this money came from, whether these were Russian involved or not, what was behind these numbers, what was behind the entries.
So you and Jay, this is what's so interesting and why we like getting everyone in the conversation. You and Jay agree on a narrow factual part of this, which is that this is a key witness to everything who knows everything.
Yes, and he can also explain, the key is he can explain the ambiguities that are in those returns.
Now, do you agree, based on your knowledge of any of this, or are you not able to say whether Weisselberg will ultimately be loyal to the truth or Donald Trump if they are at odds?
Well, if you take Jay Goldberg at his word, I think Jay is giving this guy a character reference in the sense that he thinks he will be honest. Look, when you deal with numbers like this and you deal with accounting and you're asking about numbers on a tax return, he may know things that he doesn't even realize would be damaging to Donald Trump.
Right, that if he just walks through certain things, where that account was, what the tax and debt was on it, who was behind it, as we were discussing earlier in the show with their other oligarchs. What about the Lanny of it all?
Well, I think that we're dealing with one tape here. I mean, the problem that I think Lanny Davis had and Michael Cohen had was that Rudy Giuliani was going out and lying about what was on that tape. He was mischaracterizing the tape. He was saying that Trump was saying that it should be in cash. Anybody listening to that not to use cash but a check, Any normal person listening to that tape is going to realize that Trump was suggesting cash, that it wasn't it's not exculpatory as Rudy Giuliani claimed it was. It shows that Donald Trump had his staff lie about that whole incident. And
yeah, but it seemed more politically bad than legally bad, because it did show lying. Any straight reference was they denied this, and Trump now on tape knew about it, was in the loop about it.
That's right.
It didn't seem to show, alone on its face, a crime on the tape, a legal problem.
No, but when you put it together with everything else, when you put it together with the Stephanie Daniels, you put it together with the other statements that have been made with respect to both women,
yeah,
it puts together a case. Now,
and finally, I got to go quickly. One more important thing. I want to play Preet Bharara. We mentioned this in the show. While everyone's saying what's going to happen, Donald Trump seemed keenly aware there was some kind of interest to him in SDNY. These are initials most Americans may not have thought about. Donald Trump was thinking about his legal exposure, and he summoned that prosecutor at the time to the Trump Tower. Take a look.
President-elect asked, presumably because he's a New Yorker and is aware of the great work that our office has done over the past 7 years, asked to meet with me. We had a good meeting. I said I would absolutely consider staying on. I agreed to stay on.
So he agreed to stay on, and then later it was exposed Trump was personally calling that federal prosecutor, and in a way that they thought was inappropriate, and trying to buddy up to him, and then ultimately he was fired. Does that fit into any of this?
Sure, it fits into exactly what he was trying to do with Comey. He was trying to get a pledge of loyalty. I mean, Donald Trump has put his fingers into every aspect of our criminal justice system. I mean, he is even involved in jury tampering to the extent that he's going out there and telling the public that this is a witch hunt. If you look at what happens in the next couple of days in that Manafort trial, when the jury is voir dired, when they're questioned, you're going to find a lot of people repeating the lies that Donald Trump has spread out there, which in effect is jury tampering.
Right, which is
it's
a big
part
question.
Of obstruction.
Well, we always like hearing from Jay as a Trump person, you as more of a prosecutorial critic. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.